What's up, players? Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to make some logo animations that kind of resemble sandy grains that are wet. The first one that we're going to do is just the Houdini wet grains, like default solver shelf tool. The second one that we're going to do is a flip fluid simulation. And the third one is also a flip fluid simulation, just with a slightly different setup. And we're going to go through everything. I'm going to show you the basic technique just with boxes and how to get it rendering. And then we're going to go through again and look at how we can apply it to different situations. And then we're going to look at the specific settings that I used for these three examples. So super excited about it. It should be great. And let's get cracking. So we're just going to start by dropping down a geo node, and then we're going to create a box. And then from that box, we're going to go up to grains, wet sand, click on the object, and then click enter. And then that'll create an auto dot network and the geometry for grain particles. Then we're going to go up to collisions and create a ground plane object and move it down so that it is on the ground plane. And then we can start the simulation with that playhead right there. And we don't need to display the ground plane object, so I clicked it off. And then I created another geo node with another box in it for the collider, and then a transform node. And then from that transform, we're going to keyframe two keyframes and move across so that we have a moving deforming object. It's not actually deforming, but if something's moving, I'll usually use the deforming object shelf tool if I'm just trying to get things done quickly because it registers movement. That's technically a transforming object, but if we play that, we'll see that it is colliding. Then we're going to split the view, start the Redshift render view, and nothing's going to happen because we need to look through our camera and we need to make sure that our grain particles are rendering as particles. So even if we put a light in the scene and drop down a RS light, we're not going to see anything because we need to go to Redshift OBJ, particles, render object as particles. Then if we restart the simulation, we'll see these particles. And we can cache the grain, up-res the sand from here. But that's pretty much it. I don't usually use a grain up-res. I like to simulate most of the pop grains, but it is helpful if it's there. So now we're dropping down a Redshift material. We're plugging the Redshift color user data into the base color. Then we're going back to the grain particles node and changing the material to sand. Here we are also changing the Redshift user color data into the reflection node. Dropping down another grid for the background. And that's about it for the basics of how to create a wet sand simulation. I know it was a little fast. We'll revisit it again in a second, but I want to show you a second technique just in case you like it a little bit better. This was the second technique that played in the video, and this is just using a viscous flip fluid simulation to generate points that will be rendered as sand. And you can get a unique look. It's not the most physically accurate of how wet sand works, but it's kind of fun, and let's jump into it right now. So we're dropping down a geometry node, and we're just going to create a box, call it logo, and then go into particles, fluids, flip fluid from object. Change the particle separation a little bit in the DOP network to, I'm using 0.03, and then in particle motion reseeding, do not reseed the particles. That will keep every point constant throughout. So now that we're playing it, we need to go and enable viscosity in the flip solver, and then go into physical viscosity and up it quite a bit to something like 150. And I think I might even go a little bit higher now to maybe 300. And let's take down the timescale and up the substeps a little bit. That sometimes helps fluid simulations a teensy bit. And now we're just going to create a collider body. So drop down a geo node, add a box, move it around. And then here I'm just keyframing within the box node. So you can pause the simulation and stop the simulation right here. So if you're keyframing stuff and you don't want to simulate, just pause and stop the simulation. But then, yeah, go ahead and get on with keyframing everything. And yeah, that won't collide yet because we haven't made it a collider. So you need to make that geo object a collider right there. And I know this is a little fast. I sped up this just so that hopefully if you kind of know what you're doing, it might save you a little bit of time. If you don't, it might be a little bit confusing, and you can just roast me in the comments and say I'm the least helpful teacher on the planet. But right here, we're kind of getting some interesting looks. Obviously, it's not like crazy, but now we're going to start to render everything. So I'm kind of freeze framing. I'm turning off the collider, the viewing of the collider, and I just have the logo fluid turned on. I'm about to turn off the logo fluid interior, but dropping down a Redshift light here and just hopping into the logo fields node. And so I'm just viewing the particles. And then from here, I can render the object as particles, global scale multiplier, maybe 0.3 or something like that, 0.4. And that looks a little bit like sand, but it kind of has some interesting and cool movement. And then here I can randomize the color with an attribute randomize node, and then create a sand node or a sand Redshift material network. Plug in the Redshift color user data into the base color, and then you'll get some variation in the color, which helps with realism. Right now it's a little too colorful, so I'll drop down a Redshift ramp, and this is where you can kind of choose what colors of a gradient you're going to. And then you can also plug in that Redshift user data color into various nodes like transmission weight or reflection weight. And yeah, I hope you caught all that. My apologies if you didn't, but I hope that was at least kind of helpful. But now we're going to dive into how I actually made the very first project file with a logo. So I just have a geo node with a file that I made in Illustrator. And I'm going to drop down a wet sands node onto my geo node, and that will create automatically this auto DOP network. And you can adjust the particle separation up here. With art directing simulations, don't go balls out with the first go around of the simulation. You want it to be something that you can, cache through in a minute or two, so you can see what's going on, see if there's any issues, and then you'll slowly start to upres as you go along, because sometimes when you upres, more issues arise, but typically you do just need to start really slow, start really big, not a lot of geo, make your simulation, make it how you want it, and then you can up the particle separation to however small you want. That was a lot of words. Start low res when you're doing simulations. Get through the simulation, get through the scene in a minute or two, tweak everything that you need to tweak, and then don't up-res until you're almost ready to finish the project. Amateur tip. But here I'm just creating a box, modifying it so that it looks a little bit more rectangular, kind of like a grade school eraser type shape is what I was going for. And I'm just angling it a bit, and I'm going to poly bevel, drop down a poly bevel node with tab poly bevel, and then I'm going to bevel it to my heart's content, and then I'm going to hit a transform node and just get it right on that axis right there, because that's where I wanted it to go. And then here I'm going to drop down a geo node and drop down a Bezier curve. And in the top-down view here, I'm going to just start clicking, and that's going to be the path for my little eraser object. So if I go here go to constraints, follow path, bingo. And then you have to click through these little yellow or blue things. Just do what it asks for, but then it will follow that path for the entire timeline, which worked well for me. But if you go into the constraints tab, you can modify that as well. And here I am just deleting a few of the curve points because I don't want that many curves. That's why I don't do this stuff live anymore, because I make a lot of game time decisions. But we're going to drop down under collisions, deforming geometry, drop down a deforming object, and that will add the static object to your dot network and allow everything to play in the same space. Here I am just up in the particle simulation, or up in the particle separation, as if I've got the nicest computers on the planet. But really the reason is I had a while to cache this because it is not a paid project, and so I just started the cache. And then to render these particles, we already went over this a little bit, but we're going to split the view, go into Redshift render view on that second tab, go under the Redshift OBGA part or parameters and hit render as particles. And then here, that was a little cutaway. I don't know if you can tell, but here we're dropping down a light and we're putting the color user data like we did before into the base color, and ramping it a little bit, modifying it a little bit to create a different texture with a little bit of variation, but they're still just spheres. It's not like the craziest, most realistic thing. I still think it looks a little bit cool. And for the rest of this, we're just kind of putting lights high and away and adding a background. I use an emission of 1 and just white for a lot of my backgrounds, because I don't know, I just kind of like the way it looks. Here we are modifying a little bit of these colors, some of these colors, and there we go. I'll like the way it looks. Here I am animating the camera. I have a few camera constraints like look at and follow with just different paths. I think I'm looking at the eraser object for a lot of these, and you can do that if you just drop down a constraints node under your camera and add a look at. But that is the final pop grains simulation. Hey, we're just going to go through some project files now, and I can show you the exact settings that I used if you were curious. So this is the first project file. So I have my Geo1. This is just my file transformed into grain source. Point of separation is 0.005, but we changed that in the DOP network. And then I just used the default wetness of 1. And then if we go into the DOP network, I have my static object collider that's actually transforming a bit. And then under the pop solver, I have a time scale of 0.3, min sub steps of 20, and max sub steps of 20. That was probably a bit high for this collision, but I've had pop grain things not work with less than like 50 substeps, so sometimes pop grains need a lot of substeps. Particle separation of 0.005, internal collisions weight 1, stiffness 10,000, clumping 0.745, stiffness 34.1955, and explicit constraints weight of 1 and stiffness of 230. Target pins, weight of 1, stiffness of 370. And with the particle separation of 0.005, you're probably looking at a pretty long render for both the simulation caching and the actual rendering of it. But I had a bit of time to put this out, so I did that. And then under the materials, Redshift net, I just have the color user data going into a ramp that's between beige and gray. And that's going into base color, scatter color, and multi-surface scattering. And then under the subsurface, scatter weight is 0.38. And that's what I used for that one. Now let's check out the third one, which is the flip fluid with a collider that's very similar to the one that we just went over. I'm just going from file one, transform, that's the logo, and then this is being referenced directly by the AutoDOP network. So this is a flip fluid simulation with the particle separation of 0.005. And under physical viscosity, I have 337. And under here, viscosity is enabled, and also under particle motion, there's no reseating. And I will note I'm using the APIC swirly model instead of flip splashy. I found APIC is a bit easier to control with macro stuff, and I kind of wanted that macro look. And then under the materials, we're doing kind of the same thing. Color user data is going into reflection roughness and depth, and then the ramped version is going into base color, scatter color, and multi-surface scattering. And I think this one has a bit more subsurface scattering scale of 1, which also added quite a bit to render times. And then as far as lighting goes, I just have 2 lights, one upstage key, and then one like little hair light to kind of add a bit of pizzazz to that little corner. Okay, sweet. So we have this third project that's a little bit different than the other two, but it's using the same exact things. We're just rendering flip fluid objects as sand, but I used a little bit of a different setup here, and I'll go through it right now. So under the main setup, I have my logo, I transformed my logo, and then I created some of these boxes around where I needed fluid to run. Then I subdivided them so they're a little smoother, and then transformed them so that we could have a clear path for fluid to run into the logo and then kind of drip down around here. I grouped them by the original logo as a bounding object, and then transformed everything but the group that is touching so that it could, follow a clear path. And then I merged those two, and then created a VDB, and then reshaped it a bit, and then converted it back to polygons to use as a collider object. So we're not seeing everything that's below it, but below the surface, it just has like some little rails for the fluid to run through and then poke back out. And then under here, this is also the fluid emitter right here. So I have this sphere that is merged, and then I combine the VDBs so that it's kind of like a Boolean operation, but I used the VDB SDF intersection combination, reshaped it a bit, and then converted that. And that's the only fluid that we have to run the simulation. And then in the AutoDOP network, we obviously have that flip fluid object. I just use the shelf tools because I'm a bit lazy and kind of don't understand what I'm doing sometimes. But then under the flip solver, I have a time scale of 0.3, min substeps of 10 and 10 on the max. Volume motion, I'm using flip splashy. There's no viscosity on this one. And reseeding, I am reseeding these particles. I probably don't need to be, but everything's moving so quickly that it would be hard to track a grain here. And then under particle fluid, I just have this cache, and I was playing around with trying to render this as fluids, but I actually liked it a lot more as sand. I would have probably needed to up-res the fluids a little bit, or do some better meshing of the fluids. But I just liked the way it looked as sands, so I just rendered it as sands. Kind of similar dealio here, where Redshift OBJ render as particles, global scale multiplier of 0.5. It could probably be a little bit smaller than that. Maybe 0.3 would be a good number, but that's what I use. And then under the VOPNet, I just looked up the particle attribute of CD and ramped it between grayish and blackish, and used that to drive the diffuse color, the reflection roughness, and the refraction weight, but I inverted it for the refraction weight with a RS Math invert color. And for lighting on that one, I thought I was almost done. I just used one light here that's kind of high and away, just how we like it. Very simple lighting setup, and then we have the two cameras. So cam 1 is a bit tighter. Cam 2 is a bit tighter. And they're just animating slowly. And then on the Redshift output, I have the different cameras selected under main. So render camera, cam 2, cam 1. Output, motion blur is enabled for deformation and instances particle blur. I just used a 90-degree shutter angle. 180 was a bit too blurry, and I wanted a bit of detail in there. And then the important thing to do if you are merging Redshift render operators is, one, make sure that you have a render operator tag in your file name, which will happen by default, so you don't need to worry about that a ton unless you're renaming the file name. I just put mine in a ship render ship name, or $hip name, but I call it ship name. And then the important thing is you want to uncheck non-blocking current frame renderings, and then you can, on this merge node, then you can start the render right there. But yeah, that's what I did. That's what I would have done. Hope you learned something. Adios.